Okay guys, so we're going to be looking at transcendentalism here. I've given you a bit of an explanation and a few resources you can look at, but transcendentalism, if you've never discussed it, it can be a little bit of a heady subject. It's a little bit dense, so I'm going to try and walk you through it the best that I can. It's very similar in many ways to Romanticism, so keep that in mind, but it has some different emphases in its focus. So if we look at transcendentalism, the first thing you need to know is it is philosophical school of thought. So it was spearheaded by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it was centered geographically in Concord, Massachusetts. So the major figures of transcendentalism were all living around the same area, so they could physically meet and discuss these ideas. It's built out of Unitarian religious and philosophical beliefs. So we do have some religious beliefs focused within it. And the major figures are, first and foremost, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then Henry David Thoreau was his sort of protege. And then we have a number of poets who are associated with it as well. Whitman and Dickinson, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, you're going to see are kind of at the end of transcendentalism. But other sort of what were called fireside poets were Oliver Wendell Holmes, Robert Lowell, and John Greenleaf Whittier. You'll see that this movement, it kind of, as I say at the end, it bleeds from Romanticism and bleeds into realism. So it can be a very fluid movement. So one thing that grew out of transcendentalism was Utopian Societies. This concept of sort of the commune or the broad belief in equal work. It was a little bit pre-Marxist, if you kind of think about it that way, a little bit pre-communist. But they weren't part of the belief system, but they did grow out of transcendentalism. One example is Brook Farm in 1841 to 1847. It was an experiment, and it wasn't the only one, but it was an experiment designed to combine intellectual discovery with physical labor. So it failed largely due to the lack of experience by the people involved, amongst other reasons such as like a fire which destroyed part of the buildings. But most of the people involved in this sort of experiment of living were upper middle class intellectuals who really had never done labor themselves. They often had servants or other people to do it for them. So while it was a noble endeavor, it did end up failing in the end. But it was world famous. It was a sort of a well-known experiment. And for example, Beethoven, the first time he played in the U.S., he played at Brook Farm. So it's kind of a cool idea. The central beliefs of transcendentalists, they believed in absolute truths in the world that one could find if you only looked in the right way. So for example, absolute wisdom was obtainable if one was able to completely transcend the senses, that is, transcend their physical being. And Emerson had a term that he used for this called the oversoul. It's a little bit abstract, but what it basically means is that you must be connected to three things in order to transcend yourself. You have to be connected to man, other people, you have to be connected to nature, and you have to be connected to a higher spiritual power. Not necessarily God, but more of a divine influence. If you could connect to these three things, then you could transcend and connect to the oversoul. So it's beyond a physical understanding of the world. Again, here, nature is moved from something to being sublime in Romanticism to quite literally being divine. So nature is divine in transcendentalism, meaning it is made perfect by this higher spiritual power, and only in nature can you find that type of, essentially a type of nirvana, if you will. There is, again, a humongous emphasis on the individual. But like you saw on Brook Farm, the individual functions within a larger societal group. And then we do have the continuation of democratic ideals. So this nationalistic pride reaches kind of a fever pitch in transcendentalism. There's also a focus on reforming some of society's ills. So they worked to focus on abolishing slavery. We're moving towards the Civil War here. They also included and involved women as relative equals in their intellectual communities. So they discussed the role of equal rights in societies for women and men. If you've heard of the Seneca Falls in New York, the Declaration of Sentiments, which was drawn up as about 100 years before women gained the right to vote, to discuss the inclusion of equal legal rights for women. And then they worked against encroaching industrialization against nature. So again, we have these movements kind of bleeding into each other. But here, nature is not just a refuge, it is something perfect. So it's something to be protected against industrialization. The basic philosophies of transcendentalism, it focused on a combination of knowledge and emotion, which was together intuition. So it didn't discount emotion, but it also didn't discount intellectualism. They also relied on intellect heavily, so they were very focused on purporting, their place in society as intellects above all else. And they focused again on nature heavily. They believed in living close to nature, so living outside of the industrialized cities. And the more close you were to nature, the more enlightened they believed you would be. They also connected to the oversoul through nature, like I've talked about. And intuition here is the highest power of the soul. They also focus primarily on being in the now. So it's the combination of God, humanity, and nature all in one. Again, they believed they were intellectuals with a perfect plan for society. So like many movements before them, the Puritans believed they were selected by God to establish the New World. Then we have the concept of manifest destiny, which you're going to see unfolded in Romanticism and in here. They believe that their intellectual movement is the plan from God or divine power to create a perfect society. And lastly, I told you I want you to really think about how these movements fit together. So a lot of the thoughts and ideals of Romanticism bleed into Transcendentalism. So you have Romantics who often get not counted as Transcendentalists, but their ideas kind of are credited with moving towards Transcendentalism. So like Longfellow, Melville, and Hawthorne all belong in that category. You also, in turn, have Transcendentalists who bleed into realism. So Dickinson and Whitman, who you guys are going to spend a week on each, they both kind of lead the way into the next movement, if you will. So keep these broader historical structures, scopes in mind as you read. Think about what thoughts maybe are being built off of Romanticism and what thoughts could be moving towards realism, or idealism as it's called sometimes. So that's Transcendentalism. Hopefully that helps you kind of understand what Emerson, Thoreau, and these other poets and writers are trying to do.